The largest collection of Chinese outside mainland China, 150,000 people, is in San Francisco, California. This and other Chinatown sections in major cities shows the continuing insularity of the society. The old ways are perpetuated: food, medicine, and religion. Traditions upheld even thousands of miles away from the homeland. But here, too, are the secret societies that often mask criminal activity like drug smuggling and white slavery. Chinatowns on the west coast of the United States began as ghettos when thousands left the mainland to flee the injustices of the Manchu dynasty. Still more filled the cities after they were used as cheap labor for the Western Railroad builders in the 1800s. During the 1930s and 40s, refugees from the war-torn mainland arrived with tales of horror inflicted upon China by the Japanese, and with first-hand information on the struggle between Mao Zedong's communist forces and the right-wing government of Chiang Kai-shek. Japanese strategy dictated that China must be crushed before the United States entered the war. Isolationism in America and a preoccupation with the war in Europe made full-scale United States intervention unlikely, but there was always a chance. In Junjing, Chiang and his advisors spurned all Japanese terms of peace, vowing to fight. But they refused to ally themselves with the growing communist army, even to push back the Japanese invaders. In 1940, the united front between nationalist and communist forces collapsed. Meanwhile, the nation itself relocated. Millions were displaced from their homes, taking their belongings, their very lives with them. Household goods, family treasures, even heavy machinery moved slowly across the interior of China, pulled by manpower up mountain river gorges. Chiang knew that help must come from the United States soon. His diplomats in Washington haplessly sought military assistance. The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor attempted to delay U.S. entry into the Asian theater, but it also motivated the U.S. government to act against the Japanese and for the Chinese. A mountain of modern American weapons of war began to move, but geography slowed this aid to a crawl. Supplies had to cross the submarine-infested Pacific, escape enemy destroyers and dive bombers. Even when supplies did make it to Asia, the only safe route was over the southern mountains of the Himalayas. Only a few thousand tons a month got through for an army of 4 million Chinese soldiers. He was called Vinegar Joe for his caustic demeanor, General Joseph Stilwell. In India, he supervised the training of Chinese soldiers and had the utmost respect for their abilities. But Stilwell knew that the Kuomintang government was confused and corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek's generals were disloyal and greedy, while the foot soldiers often went barefoot and hungry. Stilwell insisted that Chiang throw out his incompetent generals. Chiang refused. A land-based attack on Chongqing was impossible. Instead, the Japanese Air Force flew westward into the heart of China to blast Chongqing from the face of the earth. Against the modern Japanese air armada, obsolete Chinese planes made suicidal attempts to defend the nationalist capital. The air war went as badly as the Opium War against the British 100 years before. Superior firepower seemed to triumph over the spirit of resistance. Japanese air attacks serve a twofold purpose: destroy the nationalist army's ability to wage war and terrify the population into submission. But the people and factories had gone underground. Vital machines operated day and night, safe from the explosive inferno above. The gigantic civilian population mobilized, but most peasants and villagers preferred fighting within the communist brigades, like the new Fourth Army. The communists had already begun land reforms in areas they controlled. Peasants owned plots of land of their own. That was worth fighting for. Chiang Kai-shek's vague promises were not. Women fought alongside of husbands, brothers, and sweethearts in uniform. To the aid of China's battle came volunteers from America and Britain, like the legendary Flying Tigers, led by Colonel Claire Chennault, who knocked Japanese planes out of the sky at a ratio of 20 to 1. Warships blockaded the China Sea, cutting off supply lines. The goal was occupation of all Chinese ports and isolation of the country. Without oil, gas, guns, and planes, China would fall. The only alternatives for supply routes were by land, to a narrow road across Indochina in the south, or the barren Gobi Desert to the north. But neither route could provide enough material to make a difference, and Japanese presence in Manchuria could easily cut them off. There was another way. A railroad ran from the port of Rangoon in Burma north to Lashio, and there was a truck road between Kunming and the capital, Chongqing. But in between there was an impassable row of high mountains and deep river gorges. If this stretch of trail could be replaced by a modern highway, China would have a practical supply route to the sea. Experts said the road could be built in 6 or 7 years, as long as China could supply modern tractors and equipment. It had neither the time nor the machinery, but as always it had people. The road was built with shovels, picks, and bare hands. Workers of every age, by the hundreds of thousands, toiled on the Burma road. In less than 12 months, the Burma road was open. Much-needed supplies began moving into the Chinese interior, protected from the skies by the Flying Tigers. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife impressed such war leaders as Lord Louis Mountbatten in charge of British tactics in Burma. But continued Japanese raids and aerial bombing put an end to the Burma road. At the 1943 summit in Cairo, Chiang was treated with the respect he felt he deserved as leader of one of the world's greatest nations. Privately, few Westerners had confidence in Chiang Kai-shek's ability to govern, or even stay in power. In the mountains of Yan'an, the communists waited. Early doubters now understood Mao's wisdom at tapping the power of the peasant population. Like Chiang, Mao looked beyond the war, into the future. His summary of situations and use of them to his own advantage often proved correct by the passage of time. Later he will acquire the veneer of infallibility. Everything he writes or says will be regarded as sacred or correct. For the masses, political lessons were considered as important as military training. General Stilwell argued repeatedly with Chiang's misuse of trained forces. Rather than mobilize his best troops and use them against the Japanese, Chiang kept them as a personal elite guard, preparing them for use in a later civil war with the communists. To win the war, said Stilwell, he needed to command the troops, all of them, nationalist as well as communist. Chiang Kai-shek refused to cooperate. Despite intervention by Patrick Hurley, Roosevelt's representative, the breach was never healed. Chiang demanded Stilwell's recall. The general left in 1944, refusing a medal from the nationalist leader. Toward the end of the war, in Japanese-held Manchuria, Russian armored divisions moved over the Siberian border to aid their allies. Troops, tanks, and rocket assaults pounded away at the encamped Japanese enemy. Russian fighters filled the skies and helped turn the tide of the war for the communists. The coordinated communist plan of assault involved a multi-pronged attack to drive the Japanese back into the sea and retake the highly industrialized state of Manchuria. Experienced Soviet commanders handled the direct assault by land and air, with communist generals supplying manpower and guerrilla tactics. The Soviets were not entirely altruistic, however. When they retreated from the area, they took most of Manchuria with them. Light and heavy machinery was packed onto trucks and trains and shipped back to the Soviet Union. But Mao Zedong acknowledged that the war could not have been won without the Soviets. In later years, when relations cooled between the two countries, this assistance would be forgotten. Thousands of Japanese prisoners were taken, including many general officers. These lives were used in trade to retrieve Chinese prisoners, or bought back by defeated Japan with war reparations. More importantly to Mao's revolution, there was also a huge supply of Japanese guns and equipment. Negotiating with the Russians, the People's Army received these surplus war supplies to prepare to battle with the Kuomintang. People rallied around a new flag. Sun Yat-sen's white sun remained, but now the field was red. For years, the communists had gained support by land reform, encouraging peasants to take their own land from former landowners. Daily propaganda had been part of every soldier's routine. Now these millions rose to throw out the Kuomintang. Mao and his allies moved to consolidate their power within the party as well. Nothing would stand in the way of their liberation, not even other communists. High-level members of the party in Manchuria had been largely responsible for the success of the war and the consolidation of local power there. Those who had been loyal to Mao remained. Others, who leaned too far toward the Soviet Union, were eased out of their positions, and official history books as well. Lin Biao, perhaps the most brilliant general in modern Chinese history, was a veteran of the Long March and the war with Japan. He had learned much from his interaction with the Soviet army. Now his tactics shifted to the coming war with the Kuomintang. On the right, Chiang Kai-shek, self-proclaimed successor to Sun Yat-sen. On the left, Mao Zedong, brilliant manipulator with a reputation for respect for the common man. Neither generalization was completely true or false. Aboard the USS Missouri, the beaten Japanese signed a peace treaty with the victorious Allies. Chiang sent his generals to the occasion, but made sure that there were no representatives of the Communist Party. But understanding that communist leadership was a force to be reckoned with, the United States brokered a treaty. The nation would be divided politically between the Kuomintang and the Communists, but the army would be ruled jointly. At 51 years old, Mao Zedong flew in a plane for the first time to Chongqing to meet face-to-face with Chiang Kai-shek. Negotiations proceeded smoothly, and the two leaders seemed to agree with the compromise. Secretly, neither man planned to hold to his word. The defeated Japanese are tried as war criminals, but the war between left and right continued, a battle for leftover Japanese guns. Mao and Zhou Enlai sent Lin Biao and his army to take Manchuria before the Kuomintang could get there. Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek met with American General George Marshall, who tried to stave off the Civil War. Feuds resolved by talk and negotiation, not guns. But within 2 months, civil war broke out, first in Manchuria, then across the nation. Mao saw the war as necessary to controlling China. His cadres combed the mountains and villages, promising peace to those who had suffered war, promising land to those who have never owned land. An entire generation of Chinese had now grown up with war. Now the aftermath hit home. Typhus, disease, starvation, and the loss of the will to live. A major famine in Hunan province killed at least 4 million people. In 1948, the aroused nation rallied behind the determined Red Army. The Red Army made short work of the Nationalist Army divisions. American equipment given to Chiang Kai-shek quickly became the property of the People's Liberation Army, turned against the fleeing troops of the Kuomintang. Despite pleas from Madame Chiang Kai-shek, President Harry S. Truman refused further aid to the Kuomintang. Chiang had rejected every demand for reform, advice, or cooperation. He insisted on using his military to solve his problems, and even then made grave errors in strategy that let the ragtag guerrillas defeat the Nationalist Army. 500,000 lives were lost. The Communists poured southward. Chiang resigned his leadership, eventually decamping for the small island of Formosa, where he promised to one day reclaim China. He died in Taiwan in 1975. In April, the remaining nationalists tried to negotiate with Mao, but he gave them a 3-week ultimatum, telling them that the new mandate of heaven required the nationalists to lay down their weapons. Foreign businessmen packed their bags in Nanjing, Shanghai, and most every other city. The nation now belonged to the communist movement. In the United States, right-wingers demanded to know who lost China, as if any Western diplomat could have changed the outcome of the 1949 revolution. The answer was simple. Chiang Kai-shek lost China. Mao and the communists had convinced overwhelming millions that life in their new Red China would be free of the old ways, a true republic of the people. No amount of U.S. military aid could have prevented the uncounted millions from striving for that dream. Within 2 years, war broke out again, this time in Korea, the peninsula off the Manchurian coast. The nation had been partitioned between communist-held government in the north and a U.S.-backed right-wing government in the south. Fighting what it called a war of liberation with the backing of the Soviets, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and nearly overran the south. In Washington, the political right demanded that President Truman act. But after only 5 years of peace, the people of the United States did not look forward to yet another foreign war. The United Nations sent in an army of international troops, mostly American, to push back the North Korean invasion. Mao Zedong saw this as nothing less than American intervention in the private affairs of Korea. Within weeks, the UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur pushed the communist forces north, back across the 38th parallel, nearly into Manchuria. Lacking tanks and battleships, Red China sent 180,000 conscripts and reluctant volunteers to help North Korea destroy its capitalist neighbor to the south. Among this force, the son of Mao Zedong, Mao Anying, was killed in action in May 1951. Both sides fought at a near stalemate for months, freezing in the sub-zero Korean winter. Captured U.S. servicemen were coerced by Chinese experts using psychological retraining, nicknamed brainwashing in the U.S., to convince them of the political incorrectness of the capitalist system. Forced to evacuate civilians and soldiers from the Communist Army onslaught, MacArthur rashly suggested using atomic bombs against the approaching troops, and implied that dropping a few A-bombs on China might not be such a bad idea. Harry Truman removed MacArthur as commander. Like the Chinese retreat from the Japanese in World War II, mass migrations moved across the harsh Korean landscapes. American and South Korean soldiers sabotaged docks and factories to prevent them falling into the hands of the communists. treaty was finally signed at Panmunjom in 1953, beginning an uneasy truce that has lasted 40 years. In October 1950, the People's Liberation Army marched across the mountains into Tibet. The Dalai Lama signed a treaty that permitted Red Chinese control but allowed the elite Buddhist rulers to continue. Secretly aided by the CIA and Chiang Kai-shek's exiled government in Taiwan, Tibetans revolted in 1959, but the revolt was put down by the Red Chinese forces. 4,000 monasteries were looted, desecrated, and destroyed. The red flag of the communist government also flew over Mongolia, a so-called autonomous republic. Outlands like this, on the edge of the vast Gobi Desert, were useful strategically to China. Like the mountains to the west and the sea to the east, they provided a natural barrier against invaders. These nomadic Mongolians, in their portable homes called yurts, were not easily converted to the concept of communism. Unlike industrial workers, they were not exploited by management. Unlike farmers, they were neither slaves to landowners, nor did they remain in one place long enough to care about owning land. Sometimes more straightforward explanations were necessary. To put it bluntly, Mao wrote, it is necessary to create terror for a while in every rural area. Even traditional Mongolian festivals took on overtones of political rallies, an odd combination of the ancient and the modern. For 2,000 years, China had a major famine every year. Millions would suffer lingering death. One of the major changes of the People's Republic was the collectivization of farmland. Mountain terrace farms, lowland rice paddies, and systems of irrigation canals were used in a central plan to keep all Chinese people fed, at least on a subsistence level. 80% of the population farmed or fished to provide food for the rest of the nation. Fair in theory, this was often unfair in practice. Former landowners were imprisoned, exiled, or even killed. The stigma of land ownership remained with the family for several generations, like a family curse. The more successful communes were shown to Western observers as triumphant results of Maoist thought. This was part of Mao's great leap forward. In his later years, even Mao Zedong admitted the successes were exaggerated and even harmful to progress. Village life remained much as it had been for thousands of years, with the added layer of communist supervision that often hindered more than it helped. Communes were supervised by party functionaries called cadres. As members of a party, their word could not be challenged, but they were often ignorant and arbitrary. In short, not much different than supervisors throughout the centuries. Though some cadres truly believed in their cause, others simply used it for their own ends. In this nation of equality, some were more equal than others. The 20th century came slowly. Many villages have no electricity even today. Opium addiction was wiped out, the remnants of the capitalist enslavement of China. Post-war inflation was eased, and a 5-year plan in 1953 helped get the nation economically balanced at the expense of the individual. Central coordination of farming and food supplies helped wipe out starvation for the first time in China's history, though prices were kept artificially low by government order. By 1956, living standards had improved considerably for most Chinese. Mao felt secure enough now to allow debate, encouraging people to express their true feelings about party leadership. After only 6 weeks of incredible criticism from millions throughout the country, Mao reversed himself. Over 300,000 people were imprisoned, forced to work on state farms, or even executed as counter-revolutionaries. The black market was still a way of life. In the Manchu days, Westerners called this sort of corruption squeeze. Today it is called guanxi, which means connections. In this classless society, the most valuable possession can be texian, special privilege, generally reserved for party officials, their family, and friends. The government made some tremendous strides in basic education. Because of the complexity of Chinese writing, modest reduction has been proposed in the language over the decades, often fought by conservatives who wish to maintain the ancient ways. The literacy rate varies widely from 30% in Tibet to nearly 90% in northeastern Liaoning. What these official propaganda films did not show was the anti-American propaganda taught in schools, songs encouraging children to kill the oppressors and to fight to the death to take back Taiwan. Heavy industry is often hampered by outmoded equipment. The occupation of Manchuria by the Japanese in the 1930s and trade between China and the USSR in the 1950s improved some aspects of manufacture, but war and political upheaval prevented the changes from being either smooth or comprehensive. Unwieldy and often corrupt government suppliers of raw material further hampered industrial development. During the 1960s, small smelting plants were set up in the hinterlands. Peasants felt they were part of the grand industrial revolution, but the resultant pig iron was often low-grade and unusable. In the 1980s, the party began to remove itself from interference with industry, which allowed for competition and higher quality products. But even today, thousands of political dissidents are often sent to work camps to produce goods while under arrest, in effect, slave labor. Military training during work hours remains important even to adulthood. Like Russia, China has had a long period of inflammatory imperial rule, followed by decades of brutal war with outsiders and themselves. Thus, the fear of invasion is a real one, even if the enemies are unlikely or fanciful. Like this children's toy, featuring an American soldier captured and hung by the brave people of China. Gigantic celebratory rallies put similar expositions in America to shame with the sheer overwhelming scope. Tens of thousands of young Chinese will rehearse for weeks to create swirling images of patriotic messages. Elements of Chinese dance and opera lend themselves to such pageants, like this one, the year before Mao's Cultural Revolution. But the overwhelming numbers of people cooperating, working together for common purpose, is amazing. Few such rallies have taken place in recent years. Millions have become disillusioned to the claims of equality and fairness espoused by the official party line. The average Chinese knows that there are a privileged few, mostly party members, military men, and their families. China considered Russia its revolutionary brother in the 1940s and 50s, but as the Soviet Union made rapprochement with the West, Mao condemned Moscow as a traitor to the spirit of Marx and Lenin. China tied itself to third world countries in Asia, Africa, and America, encouraging revolution. In the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a nuclear test ban treaty. Russia had already reneged on its promise to provide a sample atomic bomb to China in 1959. The official Chinese response was suspicion, condemnation, and its own program of nuclear experimentation. The explosion of China's first nuclear bomb in October 1964 was seen as a tremendous scientific and political victory, as you can tell from this declassified propaganda film.
Passes the levels of the first nuclear tests of the United States, Britain, and France. This is the result of the efforts of our nation's workers, engineers, technical personnel, scientists, officers and men of the People's Liberation Army, and all those concerned who willingly raised high the great red flag of Mao Zedong's thought, gave prominence to politics, creatively studied and used Chairman Mao's works, and concentrated their efforts to wage a battle of annihilation with united and vigorous cooperation. This is a gigantic success of Mao Zedong's thought. This is a gigantic success of the General Line. Long live the Chinese Communist Party. Long live Chairman Mao.
To prove the invincibility of the People's Army and disprove the capitalist lie that atomic radiation was harmful, infantry and cavalry charged headlong into the bomb blast area. The soldiers wore gas masks. So did the horses. After a second test blast, the test of a hydrogen bomb followed in June 1967. This, too, was accompanied by a great blather of propaganda, hailing the Chinese workers, soldiers, and scientists for a tremendous achievement that would somehow lead to world peace. The military did not yet have a method of delivering such a weapon beyond their border, but it was still an ominous sight to foreign nations.
Khrushchev and his revisionists recklessly said that the atomic bomb would destroy all mankind. This is nothing but a devilish lie. They just want to bully the revolutionary people with their nuclear bomb. We proudly receive the wonderful news. Victory belongs to the great, glorious, and correct Chinese Communist Party. Glory belongs to our most beloved Chairman Mao.
Contrast this scene with a film using the same footage, directed by a top documentary filmmaker and peace activist in the Soviet Union.
They started realization of their fanatical ideas of world domination with the same irresponsibility that they tried to destroy the sparrows in Peking some time ago. The Maoists presented this event to the people as the greatest of national holidays. These excited faces and gay dancing on the squares evoke feelings of bitter concern. They seem to be as happy as on the harvest holiday, although there is no harvest. Their gaiety is ill-timed.
The Soviet film also showed concern about propaganda that was force-fed to innocent children.
This is alarming. This should be food for thought for Mao supporters in Europe and for my film worker friends in Paris, who criticized my staunch opposition to Maoism. The Maoists have deprived them of their childhood. Weapons took the place of dolls. Consider what is happening.
And the film drew an ominous historical parallel.
Isn't this the way Hitlerites poisoned boys' souls on the eve of the Second World War? Isn't this the way boys were crippled by the Japanese militarists? And the Italian fascists kept the pace with their allies.
The government encouraged all civilians to practice guerrilla warfare, creating a siege mentality within the nation. By demonizing foreign enemies like Russia and America, the government was able to focus the attention of the entire nation. An invading army could never sustain the supply line necessary to keep an occupying force alive. But the threat of all-out war was as common a myth in China as it was in the Soviet Union or the United States. Deep beneath major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Anshan, entire sub-cities were built to continue the government in case of all-out war. Living quarters, communication centers, shops, and thousands of bicycles for transportation to a complex series of tunnels. Countrysides, too, prepared for armed onslaught from the traitorous Russians. Peasants were taught how to plant landmines, shoot makeshift anti-tank weapons, design booby traps. Like many other governments throughout the years, Mao and the leaders of Red China created a fictional external threat to divert the people's attention from problems at home. Mutual distrust between China and Russia worsened during the Vietnam War. Soviet military aid helped the North Vietnamese invade neighboring Cambodia, and large numbers of Russian troops lined the borders of Mongolia. Mao saw the fight of the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh as a reflection of his own fight against capitalist imperialism, against Western aggression. But the tide changed after American withdrawal and communist takeover of the South. The Vietnamese communists themselves began aggression into occupied Cambodia, and even threatened to push north into China. A mass wave of Red Chinese soldiers invaded North Vietnam in retaliation, but were pushed back. This defeat caused the government to restructure many of their obsolete methods of defense. Infuriated by inter-party opposition to his great leap forward, Mao launched a purge of all things that threatened his plans, the Cultural Revolution. Millions of students formed the Red Guard, traveling free throughout the countryside to tear down anything they saw as hindering Maoist progress. Millions were jailed on groundless accusations. Beatings were commonplace. Ancient landmarks were destroyed. Lives were ruined. One man named Li had 3 daughters, Li Aiguo, Li Aimi, and Li Aidong. A rabid red guard pointed out that if you lined up the last syllable of each girl's name, it read, Li who loves the Guomindang. The father, a veteran general who had served the Red Army proudly, was imprisoned as a traitor. Many of the Red Guard used the Cultural Revolution as an excuse for rape, thievery, even murder. Industrial progress came to a standstill. For nearly 10 years, the so-called reactionaries were hunted down, until even Mao Zedong realized things were out of hand. Mao turned to his old friend Lin Biao to use the army to restore order. Mao, Zhou Enlai, and their followers now understood that warmer relations with the U.S. and USSR could benefit China. Lin Biao disagreed. After an attempted coup in 1971, the plane carrying Lin Biao, his wife, and several others exploded over the outlands of Mongolia. A full explanation has never been offered by the government. The same year, the Guomindang seat at the UN was taken by the People's Republic of China. Most nations of the world now recognize the obvious, that China had a legitimate communist government. President Richard Nixon, who had made his reputation in the 1940s as a hardline anti-communist, made the official U.S. recognition of China. He personally traveled to Beijing, walked along the Great Wall, and met with Chairman Mao. Chinese reaction in America was mixed. Many living abroad had never approved of the communist government. Many more had fled the nation in fear of it. German companies like Volkswagen were welcomed as potential partners, something that would have been unthinkable a few years before. Germany had been Japan's Axis partner during World War II, but now Mao thought only of modernizing his nation. Yesterday's enemies had become today's friends. The chairman's power had weathered revolution, attempted assassination, and infighting. Now enfeebled by Parkinson's disease, Mao still called the shots. When President Gerald Ford made his visit to Beijing, Mao clearly had no idea who he was. Many of Mao's duties were taken over by others, including Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. Deng fell from favor several times, but always managed to return to power. Both Mao and Zhou died in 1976. After a complex power struggle, Deng resumed power in 1977. Negotiations between U.S. interests and China were done by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who Mao clearly did recognize. Kissinger's work was not entirely altruistic. In later years, his consulting firm would make millions on behalf of corporations doing business in China. With this new openness, the ancient techniques of acupuncture began to receive widespread attention in America and Europe. This method of divining and treating illness involves looking holistically at the body and uses an intricate system of needles inserted into specific points to rebalance the flow of energy. Acupuncturists began administering in major cities across the globe. Some saw diplomacy with capitalist countries a betrayal. The Gang of Four, including Mao's estranged wife, Jiang Qing, pushed for a return of the Cultural Revolution, but the official line had changed. For their revolutionary zeal, the Gang of Four was imprisoned and disgraced. Some things never changed. Outlying provinces in the mountains and forests continued many of the traditions of their ancestors, especially concerning love and marriage. This village tradition involves a ceremony in which men dance around young ladies to attract their eye as prospective husbands. In the mountains of Guizhou, another ceremony is observed. Would-be husbands wake their prospective girlfriend by poking a stick through a hole, with rather obvious symbolism. She asks the man's name. If she is pleased, she will ask the young man to spend the night. If not, he goes home alone.
喂，别乱捅啊！对了，斯文点，慢慢来。终于给弄醒了。姑娘，先问一下是谁呀？你呀，哼，本姑娘不奉陪，把竹子就没收了。小伙子碰了钉，只好回去了。不久又来一个了，同样用竹子去捅他。咦，看姑娘的表情，这个有点意思了。
More ancient and more charmingly direct is the engagement festival called the 6th of June. Unlike the puritanical cities under communism, village life acknowledges sex and nudity as
the
natural
Moshu society in the
and
Yongning area
village maidens bathe nude in the
marriage.
stream.
After an intricate candlelit ceremony, the young men call out melodically
If a
to the
certain girl
approaching young
meets a
women.
young man's approval, he gives her a sign, a red ribbon.
很快就会情意相投。到晚上，小伙子
If the woman chooses, they are married for the night. If the young man does not return to the girl's house the next day afterwards, the marriage is over, and they try again with someone else.
看过满意了，要有所行动。不过是很有礼貌、很斯文的。男朋友很珍重的，第二天早上，男的就要回家干活，真开心啊！丝带是定情的信物，有了信物表示名花有主，那就表示情意深长。
In major cities, because of ancient restrictions on social intercourse, meeting someone can be very difficult. Arranged marriages were the norm for centuries. Officially outlawed, they still occur. The official party line suggests that no man marry before his 30th birthday. Women by that time are often considered unmarriable. And the city overcrowding gives lovers little chance to be alone. But even the state cannot prevent love. Others avail themselves of more modern matchmaking procedures. like official party-sponsored dances and computer dating services. In some major cities, there are street corners which are exclusively used to meet members of the opposite sex, with marriage in mind. The population of China is now more than 1 billion. By official decree, only 1 child is allowed per married couple. But even so, there will be 1.5 billion Chinese by the year 2100. The strict Chinese code of society usually requires introductions between strangers. Here, a man can approach a woman and simply begin a conversation. They don't always get lucky. Today, the most westernized city of China is Hong Kong. Westernized in style since its establishment as a major seaport in the 1840s. It began as an international seaport during the Opium Wars when the Emperor demanded the British leave the Portuguese port of Macau nearby. British ships anchored instead at the mouth of the Pearl River between Hong Kong and neighboring Kowloon Peninsula. It was a British Crown colony for 100 years, though the term was amended to territory in 1976. Hong Kong and neighboring Kowloon fell briefly into Japanese hands during World War II, but have remained an independent jewel of Asia for most of their existence. The sheltered harbor and strategic location have made it a unique global crossroads. The population was less than 100,000 when the British government leased the land for 99 years in 1898. By 1941, there were 1 million inhabitants, 96% of them ethnic Chinese. Today, Hong Kong has 6 million people, 25% of them under the age of 24. Modern high-rises stand shoulder to shoulder with dilapidated tenements. It has one of the highest population densities in Asia, an average of 427,000 people per square mile. With only a limited amount of land, the only way to build is up. Multi-level shopping malls, bright with neon, advertise products from around the world, especially electronics from Japan. The nightlife is said to be unsurpassed anywhere. A center of international banking, Hong Kong is the most capitalistic city in China. When the British lease runs out in 1997, ownership of the city will revert to Red China. But Beijing promises a high degree of autonomy to the citizens of Hong Kong and the businesses. Nevertheless, many international corporations are unsure what the future holds. The opening of China's doors reintroduced the giant panda to Western eyes. Closer to raccoons and bears, the panda feeds on bamboo shoots and is an endangered species protected by law in the wildlife preserves of the Sichuan Mountains. The vast subterranean network of tunnels, offices, and shops beneath Beijing were originally designed as gigantic bomb shelters, preparations against the inevitable war with the Soviet Union and/or the United States. But that inevitable conflict never occurred. Instead, they were converted to practical peacetime use, becoming the basis of an intricate and modern subway system. Though far less extensive than systems in New York, London, or Paris, the short lines are used by literally millions every day. An ancient saying is roughly translated as, "You're nobody until you've seen the Great Wall." Every day, thousands of visitors take the 40-mile trip from Beijing to Badaling, and hundreds of thousands have scrawled their name on the eternal structure, much to official disapproval. Fascinating to natives and foreigners alike is the Forbidden City. In imperial days, even entering the gates of the emperor's personal palace was unthinkable. Now the vast grounds and buildings are a government museum, reminding visitors of the triumphs of Chinese art, as well as the incredible excesses of the emperors. Adjacent to the Forbidden City is modern Tiananmen Square, built to exceed Moscow's Red Square in size, design, and majesty. This it does, covering nearly 100 acres. Most times it is pleasant and peaceful, a place for long walks, conversation, or kite flying. But it was also here that gigantic parades of military strength were held. Here in the 60s that Mao exhorted the Red Guard to overthrow existing party controls. And in 1976, 100,000 citizens staged a spontaneous wake for the late and beloved Premier Zhou Enlai. Zhou, a moderate, had tried to protect his nation from the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. The government sent in armed troops to destroy the funeral procession. A long bulletin board, Democracy Wall, is a source of news, gossip, and one of the few methods of speaking out against the government. Hu Yaobang, chairman of the party, had called for reforms. On April 15, 1989, Hu died of natural causes. College students, intellectuals, and pro-democracy citizens rallied in peaceful parades to let the government know that these demands for reform would not be interred with Hu Yaobang. In a plaza facing the People's Hall, the demonstrations grew. Hundreds of original protesters were joined by thousands of others. Armed troops watched from the sidelines as students and intellectuals were joined by industrial workers, doctors, nurses, reporters, scientists, even party cadres and members of the Beijing police. Demonstrations continued for weeks, but since the government had allowed news coverage, the disturbances were seen in every part of the world. The situation heated up with the arrival of Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, the first meeting of Soviet and Chinese leaders in 3 decades. Gorbachev had introduced glasnost, openness, in Russia. Now the Chinese wanted the same openness in their own lives. Gorbachev did nothing to encourage the overnight change, but the international media coverage of his visit focused the world's attention on Tiananmen Square. The crowds grew to nearly 1 million people in Beijing, with similar demonstrations in cities around the country. Zhou Jiang, a reform-minded politician, met with the protesters, but he wept before them. "I'm too old, but you are young. Live to see China's modernization." Weeks later, Zhou pressed for reforms. He lost his gamble to the diminutive hardliner, Deng Xiaoping, and the Politburo stripped Zhou of his rank. In June, nearly 2 months after the demonstrations began, art students unveiled a 33-foot tall statue called the Goddess of Liberty, draped in the red of the People's Republic and light blue of Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang. But the cry for democracy was crushed on the morning of June 3rd. Armored divisions rolled through the Beijing streets. Demonstrators fought back with bottles and homemade gasoline bombs, but they were no match for a trained army. In the most stirring image of the Beijing massacre, one man stood alone against approaching tanks. Observers estimated as many as 10,000 people were killed by the Army's action. But the Army was not united. Some units, like the 38th Army, had refused to shoot fellow Chinese. Others, like the 27th Army, were loyal to Deng Xiaoping, but the demonstration had been crushed. An American cameraman interviewed this dissident after the bloody affair. But the Chinese government pirated the signal and rebroadcast it nationwide, calling the man a traitor to the People's Revolution. The arrests that followed in the wake of repression numbered in the thousands. People were hunted down, jailed, or shot on the spot. The future of democracy in China, indeed the future of the Chinese people, is unknowable. The unbroken thread of history continues. The old ways persist alongside the new. Some have suggested that the communist government has lost the mandate of heaven and should be replaced. But to replace the heavy hand of central government may in itself cause grief, a return to famine and war between the provinces. With the failure of communism in Europe and the continuous influence of Western thought, the genie of democracy has been let out of the bottle. Consumerism and competition have been reintroduced. But it is a two-way street. Chinese now see the living standards of other countries and want the comforts that we in the West take for granted. By the year 2000, 75% of the population of this nation will have grown up since the year of liberation, 1949. The nightmare of the Cultural Revolution will be a dim memory. Characteristically, the Chinese do not forget their history. But equally true is the fact that the young often have ideas of their own. New generations to whom war is only a vague concept have replaced those who remember the days of imperial misrule, the civil wars, and revolution. The reality of war is now learned from books, films, and storytelling, not life and death battles. The goal of most people on Earth is to live in peace, in harmony with themselves and their neighbors. It is a long journey to get to that goal. The ancient Chinese axiom says, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. A generation of Chinese have now taken that first step.